Namaste. I welcome you all. My name is Utkarsh Garg, a researcher at Indic Researchers Forum. I will be your host for the third session, The Challenge of Foreign Interventions Securing Indian Institutions. The session is chaired by Honorable Ambassador His Excellency Anil Trigunayat, sir. He is a former ambassador to Jordan, Libya, and Malta. As a career diplomat, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat has served in the Indian missions in Cote d'Ivoire, Bangladesh, Mongolia, USA, Russia, Sweden, and Nigeria. He served in Moscow as deputy chief of the mission in the rank of ambassador. He was also India's ambassador to Libya, Jordan, and High Commissioner to Malta. He superannuated in the year 2016. He is a regular contributor and commentator on foreign and economic policy and education and interfaith dialogues related issues, West Asia, Africa, and Russia, and managing India's interest in the conflict zones are his special areas of interest. Anil Trigunayat sir is a distinguished fellow and head of West Asia Expert Group at the VIF, Vivekanand International Foundation. He is associated with several think tanks and chambers of commerce. He has published papers in books and periodicals. Currently, he is serving as the chairman of Confederation of Education Excellence. The speakers for this session are Madhav Das Nalapat is India's first ever professor of geopolitics, vice chair of the Manipal Advanced Research Group, and UNESCO Peace Chair at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at Manipal University, India. Professor Nalapat is the philosopher and ideologue who has defined India's new nationalism since the 1980s. He believes in and promotes India as a global power. His mantra is India First. As editor of the Mathrubhumi Daily and as later as the editor of at the Times of India, he increased their respective circulations exponentially. He is the author of seven books, the latest being The Practice of Geopolitics. His current positions include editorial director of ITV Network, Ambassador Soumen, with a distinguished diplomatic career spanning over 3 decades. Ambassador Ray's expertise has been on in some of the most turbulent regions in the Middle East and Africa. His journey commenced in Baghdad during the Iran-Iraq War, where he was initiated into the complexity of conflict diplomacy. His extensive observations are rooted in his experience during two diplomatic postings in Baghdad, one during Saddam Hussein's regime and another just before the outbreak of civil war in Bashar al-Assad's Syria during the Arab Spring. He watched closely Israel-Hezbollah conflict in the year 2006 as well as Israel-Hamas war of 2008. Ray was privy to Syria and Iran's covert involvement in their proxy wars. Additionally, he served in challenging environments such as Somalia during the civil conflict, as well as Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Upon retirement, he continues to analyze these dynamic scenarios and crafting articles based on his profound research and personal experiences. Brigadier Kuldip Singh Sir was commissioned in the Indian Army Armored Corps in December 1976. He has also served in India's Defense Research and Development Organization on two national level projects. He served as a director, intelligence coordination, Defense Intelligence Agency. He was the longest serving head of the defense wing in the National Security Council Secretariat, Prime Minister's Office, where he specialized in strategic estimates, intelligence handling, macroeconomics, demographic and environmental studies, advanced technologies, NBC CBRN, and space technologies. Apart from this, he was the senior consultant in the National Disaster Management Authority, Government of India, and country representative and consultant at Asia's Disasters Preparedness Center, Thailand. Lieutenant Colonel J. Sodhi Sir is a veteran from Bombay Sappers Corps of Engineers of the Indian Army with over 21 years of distinguished service. He is an alumnus of the National Defence Academy, Khadakswala, Pune, and the Indian Military Academy, Dehradun. He has been part of the study team sponsored by the Government of India to study the tsunami that hit the Indian coast on December 26, 2004. He has been part of the rescue and relief operations in the Bhuj earthquake that hit Gujarat on 26 January 2001. He has been awarded Chief of the Army Staff Commendations Card and the General Officers Commanding in Chief Commendation Card. He is now a media personality whose articles on defense and strategic issues are frequently published in many reputed publications, and he often appears on leading Indian and foreign televisions and FM radio channels for discussions. He featured in the World Book of Records, London, and the Indian Book of Records for his article in print media and news channel appearances. Currently, he is the editor, Global Strategic and Defense Use. Before I invite Trigunayat sir, I would request the audience to kindly turn off their mics. Please write your questions in the chat box, which will be answered during the Q&A session. Sir, the floor is yours, all yours. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Utkarsh, and thank you, India Research Forum, for organizing this excellent event. In the previous panels, we have had superb presentations that had basically touched upon several important areas in the kind of warfare, the kind of influence operations that we are witnessing. But one of the most important of those, which is being used by most countries, is, of course, the challenge of foreign interventions and how do we secure ourselves? How does India deal with those? Because in my view, as of now, we do not seem to have a robust communication strategy which is proactive. Very often we tend to be reactive. So this is something that we'll have to think about. I am very fortunate to have a super panel which I'll be moderating, and they are all great experts in their own fields and friends also. So I look forward to their ideas, their approaches, and new germinations of thoughts that could perhaps help the government in framing some strategies which they're already doing. We have heard about some of those. But as you know, Eleanor Roosevelt, she said that great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and minds discuss people. But let us not forget, this is the people who matter and are the drivers of ideas, events, conflicts, and wars. So therefore, it is very important to know who are there. Now, that is one of the reasons that we often see in the international discourse the idea of regime change that is germane to the psyche of the superpowers, basically. And today, three major countries, which are major powers also, are the masters in this art. Of course, China aces it all, but we can say China, US, and Russia are the three countries that have mastered this art of, as we call it, hybrid warfare, or you can call it by any other mean. But today, with the technology, it has become increasingly difficult also to contain these kind of ideas. Social media is playing a tremendous role in creating narratives without facts. So we are looking at it the way there is a kinetic warfare which is going on. There are two major warfare. There's several hotspots in the world which are all having impact on India. But at the same time, in the internal discourse of India also, we are continuing to see more and more interventions, whether they are in the name of the human rights, whether in the democracy index, whether the freedom of press index. So many of these assumed so-called protector of these democracy and human rights come up and they start pointing fingers at you merely to create trouble, destabilize the countries. Now, these multi-domain wars and gray zone conflicts have become a new normal and a reality, which I think, which is something that continues all the time, but it's also between the declared and undeclared wars. So that's the drawing line, which is becoming amorphous now. And with the new areas of communication, new tools of communication and the strategy, we are seeing that this is becoming increasingly more potent. Now, essentially, if you were to see and cut the lot of definitions that we look at, they are like, you can generally summarize them into 4 I's, which is the indication of depth, extent, and impact of such tricks and tactics. These are intervention, like the old wars and the old forms, interference in the domestic affairs through various means, intelligence operations and psyops, and the influence, even soft power, creating stakeholderships through consistent efforts in cultivation of elites and opinion makers. In India also, you know that we have a tradition, which is that of governance systems and diplomacy, deployed as we call them, Sam, Dam, Dand, Ved. So that's very much applicable ipso facto in the new kind of a domain and could be worked upon. Now, as I said, regime change has been the preferred choice of powers. Every country wants that its neighbors or the countries it is interested in have a government which is more pliable to its own objectives. So they continue to work in this, and we are entered into an uncharted era of a multi-domain warfare, where gray zone conflicts in a very peculiar geopolitical milieu are characterized by something called VUCA: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. But from the realpolitik perspective, the behavior of states will continue to be driven by social Darwinism, as they say, where there are no permanent friends or foes, only national interests, survival of the fittest paradigm, and balance of power, which are going to rule the roost. So there is a possibility of all of us also falling into Thucydide trap, which was referred to in the previous presentations also. Another thing you see very often is a lot of investment is going on, and consistently by various countries, especially from China and the Middle East, even others as well, in various media organizations across the world, which creates narratives. So they are able to continue the narratives despite all the limitations that are imposed on these various countries, and they're unable to. Large number of countries are not even able to react to it. Forget about doing anything else. Now, for example, there is, as per a study, the Chinese money goes to nearly 200 US colleges and universities which held contracts with Chinese businesses, which valued at about 2.3 billion between 2012 and 2024. This has also flooded the American media. As per a report based on the US Justice Department data, the US newspapers and publications over the period of 6 months created large number of global narratives, or controlled them for that matter. I was in the US, and US works on the system of lobbies and pressure groups. So one of the senators, I recall, he used to say that more the sweet you put, sweeter it becomes. So you can imagine when they say that the Time magazine received about $700,000. Financial Times, which we all try to read and depend on, is $371,000 from China. Foreign Policy was $290,000. Los Angeles Times, $272,000. So the Washington Post got about 6 million. Wall Street, like that, there are billions of dollars that are being spent on cultivating the creators of narratives and knowledge. And that is why you will see very often that we don't have to depend on direct interventions from China through it. It can also come through the West. So that is one more area that we need to understand. Another thing we are seeing is that there is a Western strategic expansion we have seen. Like, for example, in the Russia-Ukraine war has happened now, but prior to that, we have seen color revolutions that were managed by famous Victoria Nuland at removing the pro-Moscow governments through popular protests also. It happened in Georgia in 2003, which was called Rose Revolution, Ukraine Orange Revolution, Kyrgyzstan 2005, like that, Tulip and others. So they gave colors to them. And of course, then in Arab world, we also had the Arab Spring, which was mostly sui generis, except in certain countries where they wanted to have a regime change as the agenda. Of course, Russia is a powerful country. It can manage this thing and do that. But as I said, a wide range of illegal instruments and methods are being used. What are they? The introduction of coercive measures, sanctions, for example, act as a tool of intervention and in circumvention, even with the multilateral institution or UN Security Council resolutions, provocation of coup d'etats and military conflicts, threats, blackmailing, manipulation of the consciousness of social groups. Social engineering goes on. Offensive and subversive actions in the information space. A widespread form of interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states is a common theme today. Unilateralism and justifications created, as Ambassador Ray will speak about Iraq, for creating essentially the evidence, which was eventually manufacturing rather evidence, which was later proved to be false. India, we are seeing it now during the election time, as we have been writing all about it, that it is going to work. It will be much more until June 4th. You will see many more things coming up We are seeing that the Western countries also have become a part in it. They're always there, but they don't like a strong India, a strong leadership, and a stronger country. That's as simple as that. Pakistan used recently also, all the schools got the threats of the bombs and all. Now they use the Russian domain to send emails from a Pakistani cantonment as per some studies. This is the kind of things that is happening, and we need to be prepared for it because this causes a scare in the country. It causes changes. Now, just 2 days ago, the Chinese ambassador has arrived, and his first statement, which has been published all over, he said, "This is my sacred duty to improve ties." Now, that's the way you operate, and that's how it is going through all the media outlets. So I think we need to look at it. The Confucius centers, which are working everywhere, and 1/7 of those are actually located in the United States itself. Think tanks, they are all being penetrated to a great extent, many of them by the foreign funding and others. So these are the creators of narratives, and they are the ones who eventually create issues. Now, currently, in Georgia, there are some protests are going on. The Georgian government parliament wanted to pass a law about foreign interference. And it has been opposed mostly by the European Union because it's a European Union candidate. And they are not worried about whether the government will fall or what will happen because that's what they want. But at the same time, they want to create this problem so that there are no tools. So during our discussion, I'll request our esteemed panelists to pay attention to these facts and try to give us some new ideas and strategies that can later be worked upon. This is my great pleasure to invite my dear friend, Professor Madhav Nalapat, to share his thoughts on the threat of Sino-Wahhabi Nexus for India or against India.
Thank you, Ambassador. And yes, I'm really delighted to be in this session. Indic studies is thousands of years old, but it's an irony of the times, of our times, that in India, interest in Indic studies is relatively recent. You were talking about the Chinese envoy's comment about it being a sacred duty to him. He does not believe in God by definition. He does not believe in any God, whether a Hindu God or a Muslim God or a Buddhist God or a Christian God or any kind of God. And therefore, to talk about a sacred duty in a situation where you don't believe in the sacred, well, you can see what misinformation and misguiding is all about. I would just request your indulgence to present my latest book, India Beyond the Pandemic. It was brought out on the 30th of last month, together with my distinguished co-authors, Dr. Joseph Chalal and Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor, who I know you know very well. And why? Because this particular book, the pandemic itself, illustrates a lot of what we're talking about. There was credible evidence that there was in the Wuhan laboratory a joint project, if I may say so. There was a third country, a European country also involved, but that role was marginal. The United States and China, it was a joint project of US agencies, Dr. Fauci and others, and if I may say so, the Chinese Communist Party and its Wuhan lab. And you had this virus manufactured. Almost immediately, once now, if you look at Chinese internal media, you will find that there was a tremendous amount of chatter on the Chinese internet about some mysterious kind of pneumonia that was spreading, some mysterious kind of influenza, some mysterious kind of viral disease that was spreading. And that came from around October, November of way back in 2019. Well, nobody noticed it. And in 2020, you had COVID appear in full fury. And at the same time, a huge operation is mounted to convince individuals this came from the Wuhan market, a market for live animals, where frankly bats are not among the items that are kept for display for use in kitchens. They are not. and there was absolutely no vector for this particular virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus that is uncovered. No human or animal vector was found. But despite that, a narrative took hold that it was a Wuhan bat or some bat in the Wuhan in the live market that caused this, and nothing to do with the laboratory. And I must tell you, it was very successful. Even the WHO was fooled into that. The Chinese Communist Party, they basically permitted flights to go from all over the world from China. They shut down internal flights. North Korea, which knows China very, very well, better than any other country does, shut down its borders to China. That should have been a warning sign. Fortunately, India was among the earliest countries to shut down our borders to visitors from China. But my point is that the pandemic illustrates the kind of warfare that you're talking about. It is an attack on health, and health is critical to the health of a society. The physical health is critical, mental health is critical to the health of a society. And when you can create this kind of very scary viruses in a laboratory and you can set them loose, and together with that, you set a prefabricated narrative that it came from a source that was completely not at all the real source, well, then you have all the ingredients of what constitutes the operation, an asymmetric operation of what I have for a very long time termed the Sino-Wahhabi Nexus, because I've been intrigued from the 1990s in the ways that the Chinese Communist Party has been very friendly with extremist groups, while the extremely harshly with even the most moderate groups in Xinjiang, the most moderate groups in Xinjiang. And again, Ambassador, I want to say very clearly that when I use the term, Sino and Wahhabi, I do not mean the Chinese people. The Chinese people are different from Communist Party, which is about 100 million people. The Communist Party, 90 million of them are lower ranks. They're different from the 10 million or so higher ranks. And in the higher ranks, the top 100,000 is totally different from anybody else. And within that, the top few hundred are completely different. So I'd only like to say, when we use the term Wahhabi, we're not talking about Sunni Muslims at all. The Communist Party has tried to incorporate it, cloak itself that we are Chinese. Actually, the ideology has nothing to do with any of the traditional philosophies of China. It is completely un-Chinese. In the same way as Wahhabism is completely against the fundamental tenets of the faith that it claims to represent. So I would only like to say, let's not confuse let's not fall a victim to that trap and confuse the Communist Party with Chinese culture or the Chinese people, and the Wahhabis with the Sunni people, or indeed the broader Muslim population in general. So, last year, that is 2023, in September, my book Cold War 2.0 came out. That was all, and a month before that, Geopolitics of the 21st Century. Cold War 2.0 was about the inevitability of an existential conflict between China and between the democracies in particular, for the reason that the reason why it was existential was, one, the Communist Party leadership was very clear that China has got to be not only the first, but basically dominate the international geopolitical landscape. Now, that would be a disaster for almost the entire world. And as a consequence, this conflict, which even today many well-meaning people say, oh, we can resolve it, we can sort it out, we can settle it. Well, even today, this conflict is existential. And as in the previous Cold War with the USSR, one or the other system is going to survive. Unfortunately, Ambassador, as you, as an expert on Russia, know very well, The West has gone off completely backwards in the direction of Cold War 1.0. For them, Russia is the threat. China is the opportunity. And I'm astonished to hear every day Western scholars say, oh, the Chinese want peace in Ukraine. The fact is, the Chinese are delighted that there is this war going on in Ukraine. They have been, of course, ensuring that the war go on. I mean, and they're not been very, their words are one thing, their actions are another. They have been very decisive in ensuring that Russia is enabled to fight strongly on the battlefield. In the case of what we are seeing, the terror attack on 7th of October last year against Israel. And of course, you had an inevitable reaction because for now, Israel, it's an existential matter. If the military wing of Hamas is not completely destroyed, it's an existential matter for Israel. And I'm really surprised it took the Netanyahu government such a long time to discover that what is happening next door in Gaza was existential. Because if you go to Gaza, you will see what indoctrination is all about. If you go to China, you will again see what indoctrination is all about. You had from 2005 onward, 2006, 2007, in your school textbooks, absolute hatred against the Jewish people, absolute contempt for the Christians. Jews were regarded as subhuman, people who should not be allowed to almost exist on this earth. These are textbooks taught to young, impressionable minds, and you can only understand what has happened to the young minds. That was in 2005, 2006, 2007. Today we are in 2024. A lot of water has flown, has gone under that bridge. And these are all not young people. Many of them are not young. The indoctrination started when they were in their teens, in their early adulthood. Now they have reached middle age, they have reached adulthood, and they got this indoctrination. So that is something that I'm surprised that Israel failed to notice, and that the Israeli government took it as nothing very much, nothing very serious. Gaza, oh, it's a small little place. They're not going to be crazy enough to attack us. The fact is, when you're ideologically driven, what you call rationality does not count. You have an irrational impulse and an irrational belief in ideology. You saw that in the case of the attack by Hamas. And I think the calculation of Hamas was that if you have about 150, 200 hostages, the Israeli IDF will not do much, because the history has been that when you have a large number of Israeli hostages, then the Israelis get very constrained. Well, again, some of us, immediately pointed out that this is now existential. We've been saying it's existential for a long time. Netanyahu did not accept it, but today it is accepted that is existential, which means they have to go in, no matter how many hostages, they have to go in and completely demolish the military wing of Hamas. And that is precisely what the IDF is doing, precisely because it is existential. In much the same way as Cold War 2.0, between China on the one hand and of course a group of countries around it, some not very large number, and other countries. And unfortunately, as a consequence of the obsession of, as you correctly said, Victoria Nuland and others, with Cold War 1.0, they are warriors of Cold War 1.0. Now, let's say I'm a scholar. I've studied a particular theory all my life. That theory I'm a master of. I know every bit of that theory. That theory today, circumstances superseded it with a new concept, a new situation of which I know nothing. I'm going to cling to that theory, and I'm going to try and convince you that there's no new theory. My old theory still works. And that's what the new lands of the world are doing. They're clinging to Cold War 1.2 because that's all they know. And they do not want to admit the reality of Cold War 2.0 because they're not studied that. For them, China has always been a great opportunity. And that is why I call Nuland, for example, a useful idiot of China. And that's why in the Sunday Guardian, you remember when we had those horrible situation in which it took 900 days for an Indian citizen to get a US visa, and 4 days or 3 days or 5, 6 days for a PRC citizen to get a US visa. My friends in different parts of the world, and I'm happy to say, Ambassador, that yeah, you and I, we have friends in different parts of the world. They informed me, and I immediately said, this is the person responsible for this 900-day delay in Indian visas. And she's a useful idiot of the Chinese. And she's doing out of a vicious anger that we are not, we are not fighting the Russians. We are not joining their war. When it will be ridiculous for our part to do so. And fortunately, our government did not do that. Our government did not bow to that pressure. And we have done what is best for ourselves, which is buy as much of Russian resources as we can, while at the same time downscaling our military purchases, something that was recommended quite some time back and which is now being very clearly followed in this. Why I'm talking about all this is, all this indicates the complex nature of kinetic and semi-kinetic and asymmetric warfare. It illustrates the complex nature of the global situation that we are facing, and in which misinformation, disinformation is an essential component. Lies, you will have just that little mixture of truth. It's like a sugar coating in an arsenic pill. You swallow somebody tells you this pill is a vitamin pill. Inside, it's pure arsenic. It will completely destroy your inside in a matter of about a minute or a minute and a half. But it's coated with a thick coat of sugar. You feel it, sugar. You swallow it, and you're gone. That is what we are facing in terms of non-kinetic warfare. And the idea is, frankly, weaken the adversary, destroy the social resilience of the adversary, make the people within that particular country fight each other, make them believe that they themselves are their own enemies, make the Malayalis fight the Tamils, make the Bengalis fight the Assamese, things like that, make Hindus fight Muslims, fault lines like that, bring in the question of a class divides, make those who have graduated to the middle class, even from the lower classes, the subject of anger, all that kind of situation. And all this is happening through the cyber world, and all this is happening through the way their memes, their misinformation, their disinformation is being disseminated across wide swathes of the cyber world. And of course, as you correctly said, the media world. I want to end by pointing out who is the enemy to the Washington Post today? Who is the enemy to the New York Times? Who is the enemy to CNN? Who is the enemy to BBC? My goodness, it's India. And they say India is the world's most horrible dictatorship, the world's most populous dictatorship. And minorities are being suppressed. Minorities are being annihilated. There's genocide. When the reality is that different parts of our subcontinent, and if I may say so in China, ethnic and religious minorities are systematically brought down, whereas, and I would say I'm happy about this, because the entire Indian people are gifted and valuable, minority and majority. Our minority population has gone up by leaps and leaps and leaps and bounds. But we are called the bad guys. And this is the strength of Sino-Wahhabi disinformation. This is the enemy we face. And it is designed to make the West hate India, India hate the West, neighbors hate India, India hate the neighbors, and make us all hate each other, so that the design of their intending hegemon to dominate the world will prevail. I want to end, Ambassador, with one sentence. India fought a unipolar world order when the United States wanted to be that unipolar hegemon. We are opposed to a unipolar world order, irrespective of who the intending hegemon is. Yesterday it was the United States, today it is China. And I can say that I'm very happy to say our country is standing by its commitment to a fair, just world where you have several poles functioning equally with each other. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Nalapat, for the brilliant analysis and connecting all the dots in the today's geopolitical contestation and how the Chinese Wahhabi mind is operating, especially that of the CPC. It is not the majority of the Chinese people, nor is it the faith-related Islamic countries, but it is the mindset, and that is there are geopolitical objectives. And you very correctly says that these kind of ideological driven impulses, whether it is in the case of Israel-Hamas war or the China's aggression hegemony, it will continue to be a very major challenge for us. And they find their partners in Washington, D.C., unfortunately, who keep changing between decoupling to de-risking and trying to have, wrong ideas about who the real enemy is. And then by the time they wake up, it is always too late. So thank you so much for focusing on this. And we have major challenges. And I know you have to leave a bit early, but for the sake of time, I would now like to request Brigadier Kuldip Singh to kindly share his thoughts about Soviet and Western interventions in India. The topic is very interesting, exactly how it happened. Brigadier Kuldip Singh.
Okay. So I will start with this, and I'll try to finish it off. The topic that was given to me said that including espionage, but I have, said that espionage, which is as old as history of mankind, is not an end into itself. Ultimately, the work of espionage or the products of espionage have to be utilized in a very sensible manner, so that is what I will be concentrating on. Now, the fact is that we keep complaining about manipulation by world powers. Well, we need to expect that. It is part of animal and human worlds and is also assiduously practiced by nations. Playing victim, pointless complaining. We cannot change the attitude and doings of superior powers unless you have the economic heft and military power and the will to do so. My next point here is that we really need to look at Deng Xiaoping's hide and bide. It holds an important lesson. We really need to wait for our time and should not try to punch much above our weight against known formidable opponents. And lastly, strategic versus tactical. We really need to choose our battles carefully and wisely. Otherwise, we can win all the battles but eventually lose the war. We also need to take only calculated risks and avoid foolhardiness and bravado. Now, coming back to activities of Imperial Russia or USSR or Russia up to date. Now, they date back to the Great Game, the British Empire. They intensified during the Second World War, and post-1947, that is after independence, roughly from the time of 1950-53, they have been reasonably benign for India on account of various reasons. Now, in contrast, the USA has been very active. Post-1947, the navies of Britain, France, Germany, Japan, etc. were decimated, and USA emerged as the primary naval power with substantial global expeditionary capability, and it began filling up the vacuum left by the colonial empires. And with the USA's critical oil-bearing slocks passing below India, it began serious overtures to ask India to join the US-led Cold War camp. Now, at this juncture, post-partition India, you're well aware, was forged by integrating 562 principal states. We had a very small armed forces which we inherited. It was busy with many things. The USA, in turn, was pursuing its Cold War imperatives and seeking bases even in India. and to augment its expeditionary capability into the IOR and towards Africa and the Middle East, and its behavior was typically imperialistic power. So the incumbent leadership was focused on internal cohesion and consolidation, but yet in the Cold War dominated bipolar world, nascent India required a powerful patron. So we opted for non-alignment and later leaned towards the USSR. Now, there was grand strategy and sense behind this. With no common land frontiers, a middling navy, no expeditionary capability worth the name, USSR could not impose a satellite status in India, while India could leverage the Cold War rivalry to extract that critical economic aid, military hardware, and technology, which we did from USSR. Now, USA perceived India's non-alignment towards and tilt towards the USSR as a grave danger, that if USSR got bases in India, or India began constructing a significant navy with Soviet help and or began acting in concert with the USSR, it would threaten USA's maritime access through IOR. So first it tried to bribe us with offers of inclusion in the UN Security Council, first in 1950 and later in 1955, the year that India opted for a relationship with the USSR. However, this offer was neither free nor altruistic, but had a rider that only after you join our camp. But with India not falling victim to the plans, the USA opted for a defense and a massive alliance with Pakistan. Now, there were other events which were happening on Asia's southern rim astride this period. The British were leaving Singapore. The Indonesian independence movement was coming under Soviet influence. Egypt and the Suez Canal too seemed to be moving into the Soviet camp. So the USA at this stage began arming Pakistan with weapons for land and air warfare with two clear objectives. That is, enable Pakistan to pose a credible threat to India on land and air, force India to divert resources from naval construction, and instead focus solely on building ground and air forces. And our budgets of the first 55 years bears, signs of this succumbing to this threat. So it was a good decision of not acquiescing to the US demand or succumbing to the bribe of the UNSC. Had we sided with the USA, perhaps India too would have been the same situation that beset some of the countries which had opted to side with the USA in that area, for example, Iran or Pakistan. Now, there's been much debate in India over USA's offer of UNSC membership to India, and after India declined it, the PRC becoming the UNSC member. I thought it's perhaps good to clarify this. Now, when World War II ended, the allies that had fought alongside the USA, that is the KMT, PLA combined and USSR, the USA was already planning to trip them up. Now, as the Normandy invasion took place, it was very clear that the outlines of Cold War had begun. Now, Britain was exhausted. France was virtually out of the fight. The balance of force on the Eastern Front was in favor of the Soviets. It was evident that without USSR drawing away large chunks of the Wehrmacht, invasion of continental Europe was a no-go. Also, there were clear limits on how far the USA-UK invasion could advance from Normandy into Europe, and that parts of Europe would come under Soviet occupation. So the US's strategic concern was that if Soviets could occupy large parts of Europe, then by co-opting its technology, particularly of Germany and manpower, an enlarged Soviet Union, that is USSR plus parts of Europe, would pose a very substantial strategic challenge to the USA. So it began playing on the fears of Europeans who were petrified of Soviet occupation. And this is where the Bretton Woods Agreement of July 1944 came in, and where a new financial system was forged, and the USA agreed to rebuild Europe, take care of the foreign policy of the 44 different countries who participated in Bretton Woods, and take charge of their defense, and also laid the foundations for IMF, World Bank, and NATO. In August to October 1944, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference took place, in which four powers, that is ROC, Republic of China, or what we now call Taiwan, with the USA, UK, and USSR, worked out the draft charter of the IPSO. And ROC was made member of that. In 1949, the People's Republic of China was established, and IPSO membership was reaffirmed to ROC or Taiwan. In 1950-53, Korean War took place, 1954-55, and then in 1955, we saw the first and second Taiwan Strait crisis. In 1960, PRC-USSR relations worsened and began worsening even further. 1964, PRC conducted the first nuclear test. 1951 to 1971, active US efforts to disrupt, destabilize, and weaken PRC. 1951, it asked Dalai Lama or Lama Thontuk to flee to India, and US President Dwight Eisenhower reoriented US covert activities to push against communism. And the secret 5412 Committee for Coordinating US Covert Operation included the Tibet program. Dalai Lama's elder brother was in touch with Washington. His other brother had close link to the CIA office in Kolkata. And by 1959, Dalai Lama had come to India along with tens of thousands of others. And the US operated Operation Street Circus under John Greene, deputy head of the CIA's Tibetan Task Force, who were collecting the what they call Egyptian fighters, which were made available by Gyala Thontuk and his deputy. They were being trained at 2 camps and were being then airdropped from erstwhile East Pakistan and Mustom. Dalai Lama was also placed on the payroll of CIA, and with the CIA also providing the Dalai Lama administration a large amount of money. Now, July 1971, US NSA Kissinger visited PRC to seek support for ending the Vietnam War. It was followed by rapprochement with the People's Republic of China. October 25, 1971, the General Assembly approved Resolution 2578, replaced ROC with PRC in UN membership. And in November-December 1971, the PRC was recognized by the ILO, ICAO, FAO, IAEA, etc. In sum, from 1950 till 1971, if the USA had really wanted to induct India into the UNSC, it had all the time in the world, but it didn't do so. In contrast, just as the 1971 Indo-Pak War was building up, it inducted PRC into the UN Security Council. We are also aware of the Monroe Doctrine, how it started off with the sinking of the US Maine, the Spanish Wars, and how it expelled the European powers from the Greater Caribbean, annexed the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, and established control over the Greater Caribbean, which allowed the US Navy to emerge as the dominant maritime power in the Western Hemisphere. Incidentally, the People's Republic of China is now emulating USA and trying to do a Greater Caribbean in the South China and East China Sea. Now, after Second World War, the USA also operationalized what is known as Operation Paperclip. After Germany's surrender, US troops searching Europe were stunned by finds of German technology and weapons, and therefore Operation Paperclip under US Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency was commenced. It initially envisioned transporting 88 captured Nazi scientists to Konus, putting them to work on US projects, even though these scientists have helped design weapons facilities which killed many soldiers and civilians across Europe and USSR, and should rightly have been tried at Nuremberg. Unfortunately, the US government whitewashed parts of their redesignated prisoners of peace and kept the secret even of the Justice Department Office of Special Investigation. Overall, it took out over 1,600 Nazi German scientists, engineers, technicians, dismantled, relocated entire plants, factories, and facilities, as also confiscated large amounts of German patents, copyrights, and trademarks. Now, it's good that India has been very careful about becoming a full-fledged strategic ally of the USA and not becoming its Ukraine against China. Now, post-World War II, the USA turned on its own allies, that is the USSR, the CCP National Party combined, but rebuilt Germany, Japan, the same Japan that it nuked twice. In 1948-49, USA recognized ROC. 51 to 71, we have already seen it tried its best to destabilize PRC. 71 to 72, it reached a rapprochement with the PRC with the help of Pakistan, transferred high-tech weapons directly and through UK to China, reportedly shared critical nuclear weapons technology with the PRC, abandoned ROC. 1953 helped overthrow the government of Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, and 1979 abandoned the Shah of Iran. 1979 invaded Afghanistan, funded the jihad, flew militants to corners, trained them at CIA sites, indoctrinated them at the Al-Qifa Mosque, also known as the Brooklyn Jihad Center in Brooklyn, developed new books on militant Islam to radicalize them and distributed them. And after the USSR withdrew, it abandoned everyone who had participated along with it. 1991, the USSR broke up, promised not to advance NATO into the near abroad of Russia, but abandons Japan, Asia Pacific, decline of the Asian tiger economies. 1994, Chechen War supported by the USA. 9/11 again took support of both Russia and China. And 2003 onwards, attacks Iraq based on the so-called WMDs. CIA-sponsored color revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia. In 2010, it realized the strategic mistake of tying down entire might of its state in a small area between the Central Asia and Persian Gulf through two wars, that is Afghanistan and Iraq, which had led to the uninterrupted rise of PRC from 2001 to 2010. So in 2011, it intervened in Iraq, in Syria. The rise of AQI, ISI, ISIS is what we know. Fighting AQ in Afghanistan, allying with AQ affiliates in the Levant, utter chaos across West Asia. The grand strategy was disruption with balance of power, and then withdrew from Iraq. 2013, it starts to instigate Russia into a war using NATO membership for Ukraine as a cat's paw. And 2011, start of serious overtures to India and hints to assist it in downsizing China. PRC has been following the post-war model of Germany and Japan, and not the militarized models of pre-war Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, or USA. It has fought no serious war since 1979 and has been able to build an economy that's larger than USA's on PPP basis. USA, on the other hand, has been at war for 65% of the 20th century and 100% of this century, has spent over 10 trillion on these wars, including Homeland Department. Infrastructure is deteriorating, manufacturing is low, no longer the unique holder of critical technologies, in danger of losing its global preeminence, and hence averts to India. Studies indicate USA will not be able to prevail upon PRC in the Asia Pacific theater, primarily on account of two reasons: that China enjoys the home theater advantage and has also modernized its armed forces. Points to ponder. The USA has always struck down rising powers. If India becomes USA's Ukraine in downsizing China, would India as the next rising power be the next target? Perhaps with a USA-China alliance this time. Okay, we have a look at the new frontier of war and interventions in India's fault lines. The fact is that no country is perfect or fully stable, and hence we need to avoid exasperating fault lines. Very few nations have good relations with neighbors, so we should expect hostility and attempts by neighbors as others to exploit segments of our populace. It's a state responsibility to ensure segments of populace are not alienated, or coherent political process are undertaken to settle and end grievances, whether genuine or imagined. The RAND study of over 100 terrorist entities and insurgencies merits mention here. It shows that 43% of terrorist groups ended through political process, as most groups seek narrow policy goals. 40% ended through well-trained policing combined with intelligence services, because the local police and the local intelligence agencies, usually with permanent presence in affected zones, are better knit into the populace and have a better understanding of the threat environment. 10% ended because their goals were achieved, and only 7% were eradicated with the use of military force. There's something we need to take note of. Now, what is another problem with us? The main problem with us is that instead of seriously analyzing our fault lines and trying to address them, there is a propensity to glibly blame neighboring countries and adversarial powers, which in turn allows the powers that be within our country to evade any responsibility whatsoever for what's happening. We just blame a neighbor and says, not realizing brother will not turn upon brother until and unless there are grievous fault lines which encourage that event. We persist in aggravating those fault lines for electoral profit and petty outcomes. The quality of our populace and political leaders also needs a change. How much are we really spending on education? With change being exponential, are we really preparing our populace for the future? It's a case of 21st century kids being taught by 20th century adults using 19th century curriculum and techniques on 18th century calendar. And in our case, harking back all the time to the glory of 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, 80,000 years. We are going forward with a neck pointing forward and not backwards. In sum, till we desist from and limit such actions which I mentioned in the problems, do expect every power, adversarial or friendly, to seize those events in order to manipulate us to its own ends. Now, to end, I would like to dwell upon 3 points. One, which was mentioned in the beginning, that General Bipin Rawat's June 2017 statement, India is prepared to fight a 2.5 wars, is perspicuous. It's neither original nor accurate representation of a military capability. Fighting 2.5 front war. This term was first espoused by the USA, but starting from 2016, its various national security documents have started to cast doubts on this capability or construct. And this is an armed forces which enjoys an edge of at least 2 times over the nearest rival. And they say that they don't have a 2.5 or even a 2-front capability. Now, given various dimensions of modern warfare and proliferation technology, including dual-use technology, no country today has capability to successfully prosecute a 2-front war. It is not also original. This term is also not original because India has faced multi-layered threats since 1959. Yet, after 3 full wars, 1 sectoral conflict, that is Kargil, the breakup of East and West Pakistan, many peace accords in the Northeast, in J&K, in Punjab, the end of the Cold War, and our nuclear weaponization, the original combo of threats continues to persist. We really need to think why, as no other major nation has continued to have the same combination of threats for 6 to 7 decades continuously. Now, is this a failure of diplomacy? Perhaps. War is not a pure military event, but is a politico-military affair. One main job of the political side is to ensure that all other fronts are kept quiet when war is thrust upon us by one adversary. In 1962, the Nehru government reached out to USA and UK to lean on Pakistan to stay out. 1965, the Shastri government deliberately avoided opening a second front against East Pakistan, thereby not giving the Chinese an excuse to jump in. In 71, Indira government conducted an expansive, well-thought-out diplomatic campaign in the West and USSR to keep the USA and China out of the war. So, the talk of 2.5 front is, in a way, tantamount to admission of failure of diplomacy. Now, insofar as capability assessment is concerned, we must look at the mindless reduction in logistic elements to increase teeth in our armed forces, particularly the army. We need to look at this point from the fact that most modern weapons have gargantuan needs of ammunition, fuel, etc., and all that. And here we are in the face of increasing needs, reducing the logistic element to increase teeth. During the 1991 Gulf War, 500,000 people supported roughly about 6,000 people who fired shots in anger. We have no understanding of that construct. The next is modernization for the sake of modernization. And lastly is the knee-jerk responses and processes that we have. Look at this fact that armed UAVs were being used extensively in our neighborhood from 2001 onwards by the USA. But it took the Armenia-Azerbaijan war of 2 years back to wake us to realities of modern warfare. And even that only shook, it's only the Russian-Ukraine war that has shaken us now to take action. So we really need to get a hold on what we really need. The second part of the second comment that I have is that there's an abject paucity of objective, dispassionate, bias-free evaluation or discussions on national security issues. Many of us come with our own biases, political or personal, etc. And that is why we have comic, commando-style sets on TV, manufactured outrage and drama, shouting going on TV. We have people from the other side come over there, get insulted, they get paid, and they go back. Most so-called defense experts and think tanks are mere mouthpieces for political positions of either the ruling regime or the opposition. They don't know the difference between a urinal and an arsenal. So not knowing what really ails us, how do we administer these national security medicine? Now, such people are doing more damage to countries' national security than even terrorists. We need to build our leaders incrementally. Often tempting to think we are what we are today as a result of decisions of few exceptional leaders of today and some incompetent leaders of past. In reality, every country has geopolitical constraints on account of broad, abstract forces of geographical location, demographic, resources, economic, military strength, etc., as well as core interests. No leader can afford to compromise on core interest. Yet, successive leaders will be beset by the same constraints and restrictions that their predecessors faced. Many leaders try to overcome those core grand strategy constraints, and when they fail, they blame their predecessors. Last point, we substantially need to improve our diplomacy. It's about dealing with other nations and not about appeasing domestic constituencies. Today, if you talk to people, many are happy to see our diplomacy become something like a Saas Bahu kind of squabbling, with smart or impertinent, sassy, abrasive responses being given to every event of criticism or unpleasant finding by a foreign nation. Worse, people who profess to be so-called intellectuals are now lauding such kind of diplomacy. I wonder if this is acceptable. With this, I end my talk, and I'll be happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you, Brig Kuldip Singh. It was a fascinating presentation, I must say, and very, very informative, with a lot of food for thought for the politicians, bureaucrats, and diplomats, as well as, I guess, the military personnel as well. So you have really covered in a very holistic manner. One of the key things that you quoted was, I found very interesting. You clarified a lot on the public discourse that often goes on for political purposes, essentially, whether we could have obtained the Permanent Security Council seat at the behest of there is Vijayalakshmi Pandit's letters that indicate quite a lot. So they have been, everything is interpreted as per your interest. And these days we see it being talked about. But of course, there has to be a cost for something. So you need to understand which cost is there. Another interesting thing that you mentioned was that USA was at war for about 65% of the 20th century, 100% of this century. I mean, that is how true it is. That is, of course, necessary for their own military-industrial complex and to maintain their supremacy, I guess. And another thing, your analysis says that USA always struck down rising powers. So that's a good caution there. Let us see how it plays out now, because USA is also not in a position to continue to either be the policeman or enforce its diktat across geographies. It's not possible now. That's one reason that they want India to be a closer partner, and we are seeing that now. On this note, I would like to invite my friend Ambassador Soumen to share his thoughts. Where is Ambassador Ray? Can you please put on your, yeah. On regime change operations in West Asia, and he has been personally witnessed those and be part of it. So, Soumen, for about 20 minutes, floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you especially to IRF for having me in this seminar, and Ambassador Trigunayat, with whom I've got a long association, starting from the training period days. So special thanks to Anil Trigunayat, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, for allowing me to talk about this subject. And in fact, I served in that region for quite a long time. I served in Iraq, where the regime was changed. I was there for 7 years. In fact, in two terms, I was there. Once during the early 1980s, then at the late 1990s. And I left Baghdad when I could smell gunpowder literally there. So the topic is critically important for West Asia, and the lessons from Western interventions in the region are notably significant to safeguard our national institutions from those. Regime change in West Asia, has been a tool of Western foreign policy for decades. They have repeatedly sought to oust rival regimes and put what they consider better ones in their place. Still today, many Western leaders advocate coercive measures to topple the current regimes in Iran, Syria, and elsewhere. Now, what is the historical track record of this approach? And what has been the outcome of those actions? Finally, what are the lessons India should learn from such Western actions and safeguard itself against such machinations? Since 1950s, the West has tried to oust governments in broader West Asia, once in every decade on an average. Their justification for regime change in the region is always based on high moral ground, that those countries would be better off if there were different leaders, governments, institutions, and systems. But practically, they try to change the regime in only those countries which pursue domestic and international policies antagonistic to them. Once they're able to change that particular regime, they target another one on their list on the same pretext, that is, anti-nationalism of the regime, dictatorial leadership, terrorism, and state-sponsored terrorism, providing safe haven to foreign terrorist organizations, threat to the neighboring countries, and the list could go on to fit their agenda. Their motives behind the intervention varied widely, as have their methods. The Western countries follow different methods of interventions to change a regime they dislike. There have been interventions and occupation. Intervention, but not occupation, by putting up a government in power that would follow their agenda, or rather, we can say a puppet regime. Sometimes intervening, changing the regime, but leaving the people to their fate. In some other cases, sponsoring a coup. Then there are covert interventions through civil societies, NGOs, and other organized sectors of the country. This results in civil strife, public protests, which initially start peacefully but soon become violent when the government forces try to quell the protests using heavy hands. The situation soon becomes ripe for Western intervention, relying on diplomacy, rhetoric, and sanctions. They have done so in Iran, twice in Afghanistan, Iraq, Egypt, Libya, and Syria, a list that includes only the instances in which the removal of the country's leaders and transformation of its political system were the goals of Western policy. And they made sustained efforts to achieve them. All these attempts, however, have one thing in common: they failed. In every case, the Western policymakers overstated the threat faced by them as well as by the region, underestimated the challenges of ousting a regime, and embraced the optimistic assurance of the exiles or local actors with little power or support base. In every case, the West prematurely declared victory, except in the case of Syria, where the regime not only held on to power, but received a warm welcome to the Arab League, from which it was suspended in 2011. They failed to anticipate the chaos that would inevitably ensue after regime collapse, and ultimately found themselves bearing massive human and financial costs for decades to come. Now the questions arise: why regime change in this region is so hard? And why do the Western leaders and pundits keep on thinking that they can get it right? There are no answers, easy answers, I would say, to these questions. However, it is important to acknowledge that in every case, the alternative to regime change were unappealing. But as the Western policymakers contemplate the challenges of dealing with this vexing region, they should see the patterns of self-delusion and misjudgment that have time and again made regime change so tempting and ultimately so disastrous. I spoke about how the Western powers changed the regime, after effects, and results of their action. It suggests that the main ingredients of intervention include absence of previous existence of democratic norms, practices, and institutions in those countries, lack of significant ethnic, political, and cultural homogeneity, or at least a shared national narrative, and a high degree of economic imbalances in those countries. Coming to Indian perspective, some Western countries who do not like India growing from strength to strength, pursuing its foreign policy, taking into consideration its own national interest, as well as taking stance on various global issues not toeing to the Western strategic and geopolitical agenda. They have been trying to destabilize or weaken our political structure and government. But our democratic structure is firmly rooted even to the grassroots of India. So they cannot dare to tamper with that. What they are trying to do is to destabilize our social structures, defame our country, defame our government in the broad international arena. They have been doing this for quite some time. With the government's declared philosophy of Sabke Saath, Sabke Vikas, more and more people are now joining the economic mainstream and contributing to the country's economic growth. This proactive action blunts the Western countries' motives of destabilizing our country. Again, this point has been touched upon by a previous speaker about the religious harmony in our country. They frequently raise the question that is are the minorities free in India? They claim religious harmony in India is at stake. Minority communities, especially the Muslims and the Christians, are discriminated against, and their religious places are often attacked or even burned down. They make it a point to mention this to our political leadership whenever they get a chance to do that. Most of the deadly conflicts between ethnic communities are often aided and abated by these countries. In spite of our government's sincere efforts, the outsides, agents provocateurs, are able to fuel those conflicts. Indian separatist groups settled in their countries are covertly assisted by their political leadership. Violent attacks by those separatists on our missions and posts abroad are not sincerely probed into, and the culprits roam free. Then, without any concrete evidence, these Western countries are implicating now our government agencies in heinous crimes committed in their countries. The Western countries are doing this with a definitive purpose: generate social strife, violent protest among Indian multilingual, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multicultural communities, so that people vote for a government of their choice. They often forgot that nationalism or the concept of Bharat Mata is ingrained in the DNA of the Indians. Our government is continuously taking appropriate steps to stem this Western encroachment in India. With this, I conclude my speech. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Ambassador Ray, for detailing what actually happened, what were the drivers, and how this was all carried out in various Middle Eastern countries. And it is continuing. But the fact remains is that those interventions have led to utter destabilization and increase, or rather the germination of terrorism, which was unprecedented before. And that is something which is causing a bigger challenge for all the countries, which today, for which you need a global fight, but this is becoming more selective in that sense. And you have very correctly pointed out the regime change somehow happens to be a standard toolkit in the powers, I would say, not necessarily one country, but I think all major powers try to play that role, but the Western countries have done much more. And of course, they try to show that they are on a high moral ground, but a little better analysis will tell you that they are much worse than the other countries, but they have the firepower and the financial power to do so. And that's the continuous. So destabilizing in India has been going on. We are all looking at what is happening. While no country is perfect, but at the same time, the other countries just want to serve their motives by creating discontent and disrupt the religious harmony as well. And there are buyers for those arguments, whether it in the political system, religious system, or even for that matter, the economic system. So thank you so much for pointing out on all those major issues through your brilliant analysis. Now I have a great pleasure of inviting Colonel Sodhi regarding China's influence operations. China's influence operations in India, which of course has been a major challenge, because how do you deal with the master? Floor is yours, sir.
Jai Hind, ladies and gentlemen. It's my honor and privilege to be part of this esteemed panel, and my thanks to the respected chair too. And my immense thanks to the Indic Research Forum for having given me this opportunity to speak on this very important topic that concerns each one of us all. On 17th January 1999, that is on the 8th anniversary of the famous Gulf War, or Operation Desert Storm as it is also called, a book was released authored by two Chinese army colonels, two PLA colonels, Colonel Kiao Liang and Colonel Wang Zhangzui. The name of this book was Unrestricted Warfare. This book went largely unnoticed in almost every part of the world, including India. To sum up this book, it said that anything and everything that can be weaponized will be weaponized. This book, published in 1999, spoke of two events which would be proved true in the coming times. One was the 9/11 World Trade Center attack in USA by Osama bin Laden. His name is also mentioned in this book. And the other was the COVID-19 pandemic. But like I said, this book went largely unnoticed. Now, three important events which need to be discussed in brief before I come to the main essence of my talk is that in November 2012, Xi Jinping announced the China Dream, whose main purpose was the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. 9 months later, on 8th July 2013, there was an article in Win Vi Pu, which is a Chinese government newspaper published from Hong Kong, whose title was 6 Wars that China will fight in the next 50 years. The first among these 6 wars is the mention of a China-US war over Taiwan. Last year, on 3rd February 2023, the director of CIA, William Burns, said in a statement that 2027, US and China will go to war over Taiwan. The third in the series of these 6 wars mentioned in this article is that in 2035, there will be a two-front war on India. Pakistan will attack India for Jammu and Kashmir. At the same time, China will attack India for Arunachal Pradesh. If we see all the timelines point towards these two-front war in 2035 on India. I'll give 4 short timelines to show that this article is not merely an article. We all know that in China, no one can speak or write a word without the approval of the CCP. So this article coming out definitely had the approval of the CCP. The 4 timelines pointing towards this 2035 two-front war on India are, firstly, the entire infrastructure development in Xinjiang and Tibet has to be completed by 2032. Secondly, by 2030, China will construct 3 aircraft carriers, 21 nuclear submarines, and 200 warships, the work for which is going on day and night in their 6 naval dockyards in China. And we already know that as on today, China already has the world's largest navy. And in spite of that, such a big warships and nuclear submarines and aircraft carrier construction is going on. The third is that by 2027, the modernization of PLA has to be complete. And lastly, what we had been hearing for decades about string of pearls to surround India by the sea route is complete when on last year, 20th March 2023, China constructed the Cox's Bazar naval base in Bangladesh. Thus, with Gwadar port in Pakistan, Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, and the Cox's Bazar port safely under the belt, what we had been hearing of string of pearls has fructified. To add to this is the Chinese military activity going on in the Lamu Atoll in Maldives and the Kai Phu military base in Myanmar. Now, with these timelines, it is clear that this 2035 two-front war is not a myth. It is not a hype. It is a reality. And the third point that I want to tell before I come to my main topic is that in 2014, the PLA said in the military doctrine that they are capable of fighting any nation in the world in all the 6 domains of war, that is land, sea, air, cyber, electromagnetic spectrum, and space. And today we are in 2024. No other nation in the world, including USA, has expressed their capability to fight in all the 6 domains of war. With this as the background, we also need to understand what is China's strategy. The majority of the world plays chess in which the ultimate aim is to kill the king for victory. In China, they don't play chess. They play a game called Go. In the game Go, they don't kill the opponent's king or queen. They only surround the opponents until the opponent has no option but to accept defeat. Now, with this as the prelude, I would like to come the amount of advancement that the Chinese tentacles have made in India. The first is trade. We all know that the Galwan Valley incident happened in June 2020. It is ironical and shameful at the same time that despite the world knowing that the Wuhan virus, as Donald Trump infamously called it, emanated from China in end 2019, and the Galwan Valley incident, which I just mentioned, still year on year from 2020 onwards, our trade with China has grown year on year. In 2020, our trade with China was 87.65 billion American dollars. In 2021, it was 125 billion American dollars. In 2022, it was 135.98 billion American dollars. And last year, our trade with China was 136.2 billion American dollars. Despite the government of India giving good initiatives like the Atmanirbhar Bharat and the Make in India initiatives, still our traders, businessmen prefer to import from China. They need to understand that for every rupee being traded with China, part of it is going to strengthen the PLA. Our traders need to import virtually nothing from China, manufacture everything in India, even if they earn lesser profit. Today, out of the 10 materials or 10 stuff available off the shelf in the market, 9 is made in China. What can a common citizen do? He has no option. It is the traders, the entrepreneurs who have to help the government of India to free from the economic web and clutch of China. The next is discussion in the mainstream media about China as a threat. In 1998, the then Defense Minister George Fernandez had said in a statement that the #1 threat for India is China. There was so much political pressure on him that 5 years later, in 2003, he had to withdraw that statement. In hindsight, he was absolutely correct. India has 392 news channels in all languages. 892.2 crore people watch television on a daily basis. We have a population of 142 billion. Or 1.42 billion or 142 crores. We have 110,000 newspapers published in various languages in the country. The readership is 55.38 crores. Out of 142 crore population in our country, 75 crores have a smartphone. With this kind of a electronic media, the print media, and the social media reach, how many media publications or media houses speak about China as a threat? We can count on them in our fingertips. We love Pakistan bashing because that gives us electoral gains, electoral advantages. But the main threat is China. Pakistan is only a subset of China. And I would like to add here that since 2020-21, Pakistani army officers have been getting posted on a regular basis to the Western Theater Command in Chengdu in China. Foreign armies send the officers and soldiers for training, for courses, but never they post their officers in the other armies' headquarters. Pakistan has started doing this since last 3 years. Since 2021, in 2021, there was a direct optical fiber cable laid from the Western Theater Command to the GHQ in Rawalpindi for uninterrupted communication. This is for what? These are all preparations for the two-front war. So the media houses in India need to speak of China as a threat. Till the time we do not discuss the problem, we will not realize what the problem is. The problem has to be stated, and it is only and only China. But like I said, I'm on 59 Indian and international news channels. My articles are published in 40 publications, including comments. Rarely are there any media houses which speak about China as a threat? It needs deep thinking. The third is respecting the unity in diversity of India. In 1947, Aung San, a prominent politician of then Burma, now known as Myanmar, was the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, said that if the unity and diversity of Burma is played with, Burma will sink into such a merry hell, it will never recover. The next year, 1948, Burma got independence, and few days before that, Aung San was shot dead. In 1962, the military junta in Burma seized power for the first time, and they did exactly what Aung San had warned about. They played with the unity and diversity of Burma. In 1988, the name of Burma was changed to Myanmar. The merry hell continued. China started taking advantage. In November last year, the president of Myanmar has said in a statement that if the violence continues, Myanmar will split into smaller nations. We need to follow, we need to learn. We need to learn the mistakes Myanmar did. I agree that for every political party, winning in the elections is the priority. There's nothing wrong. We all want to win in life, succeed in life, but not at the cost of weakening the country internally. The fault lines which our political leaders and political parties create, it gives an ideal platform for countries like Pakistan and China to fuel internal disturbance. So we ought to respect the unity and diversity of our country. The more stronger we are internally, the more capable we will be to fight externally. The more weaker we are internally, the easier it will be for our adversaries to achieve success. Lastly, I would say that India is in the most difficult geopolitical location in the entire world. We are surrounded by two enemy nations. I have no qualm about saying they are enemies because these two nations have killed numerous Indian soldiers, numerous Indian citizens. Crores of property has been destroyed by these two nations or their supported terrorists. We are located at such a difficult geopolitical location. We are also located at the confluence of the world's three biggest areas that supply drugs to the world. That is the Golden Triangle, the Golden Crescent, and China, which has emerged as the biggest drug player in the world. Now, with such a difficult geopolitical location that we are in, and our politicians start playing merry hell with each other's community, with each other's religion, aren't we giving an idle platform for these countries to act against us? We all know, why did the terrorism in Punjab start in the 1980s? Because one political party wanted to show down the other political party. They supported an extremist who later on became too big for their boots, and the mayhem happened. The political parties support people who later become terrorists, and then we start crying that country is helping them, that country is helping them. It is we who are the culprit in the first place. Why do we support such people? It is okay if one party doesn't win an election. Not everyone succeeds in life every time. But to do it, like I said, at the cost of our internal peace, our internal communal harmony, is the biggest disservice anyone can do to a respected motherland. And like the last to last speaker rightly said, finally, I would like to say, is that more damage is being done by many of the defense analysts who come on these electronic media wearing the army caps, wearing the army medals. And surprisingly, when you speak to them, they have not even read one book. They just wear the military caps, the military ribbons. They come, they speak bombastic language to please one political party or the other, and they go back happy, having made some thousands of followers on Twitter. because they don't read, they don't know the facts. They only speak to please their political bosses. And lastly, I would like to request the young researchers of three things. One, read, read, and read. The more you read, especially of the non-politically aligned authors, the more your fundamentals will get cleared. By non-political aligned authors, I mean there are many authors who are politically non-aligned. And how you come to know is because of the facts and figures that they write in the books, the non-jingoistic language they use. They are the ones who are giving the real truth about any defense or geopolitical situation or issue. The next is have trust in our well-written constitution. And third is respect the independent judiciary we have. To make a country strong and stable, two things are pivotal: a well-written constitution and the independent judiciary. And India is lucky to have both of them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Colonel Sodhi, for the brilliant rundown on various things that are happening and your deep knowledge of China. Obviously, very interesting that you mentioned about the 6 wars that China will be fighting. Of course, 2027 is over Taiwan. The deadlines are still uncertain. But 2035, you mentioned about the war with India, which will be a two-front war. Of course, we need to be prepared for two-front war at all times, irrespective. And I would say that as far as the disruption from the social end is concerned, that is obviously, we have to be very, very careful of all the players. We can't be friends also work against you. And it has happened in 75 years of history. If people understand that countries that were enemies become friends, so there are no permanent friends and enemies, but we have to protect our country. And you have very rightly mentioned that there should be a respect for unity and diversity. That is very important because that is the crux, because that brings about an internal cohesion and a unified country which can weather any storms and any problems that can come. Social media, of course, is a major challenge. It's a great opportunity, but a major challenge also, because people don't really vet the truth about any event and they just pass it on and it goes around, and eventually 100 times if you speak a lie, it appears to be the truth for people. And unfortunately, one sees that that is being quoted or relied upon by a very large number of even good experts that one comes across. Your another very important point that you made is about the increasing business relations with China that have not been impacted. In fact, that's a dichotomy that on the one hand, you have adversarial relations with China. On the other hand, your trade continues to increase. But that is the characteristic of China's growth as a manufacturing giant over the past 30, 40 years, in which US is equally culpable. And today, everybody is trying to contain it. It will take us some time, but I hope that businesses do understand the political dimension of the trade as well. So that's very, very important. Thank you so much for detailing out all these things. Now, let us open it for the questions. And I don't see any question in the chat box. So either the people are tired or they are fully satisfied by the presentations. Utkarsh, I don't see any questions.
So the questions are coming. Questions are on the way to the chat box. Now the floor is open to questions. Yeah.
So they can ask themselves if it's not in the chat box.
Sure, sir.
Yeah. So please identify yourself if anybody has any question and identify the panelists. Unfortunately, Professor Nalapat had to go for another meeting. So the others are here, I guess. Brigadier Kuldip Singh, there is a question for you. That you had talked about foreign intervention by Western countries, China, Russia, etc. My question is that India also had the opportunity to get permanent membership in UNSC. I think this has been talked about by Brigadier quite in great detail exactly what happened, but your comments also are important.
Uh, I think I have covered this in very great
Yeah,
detail.
very
You see, the
detailed.
whole thing. Sorry?
Yeah, you had covered it in great detail, I guess.
Yes. And I would like to refer you back to my presentation, as also inform that this was in return with for a favor. That is, you allow us to get bases, etc., ally with us in the Cold War. In turn, we will consider your United Nations Security Council membership. And they had all the time till 71 when they gave it to China. So it is not that, it was being given to us and Nehru or whosoever it was rejected it. Nothing positive, nothing concrete had come till then.
Besides, I wonder if it was at all possible for anybody to give anyone else the membership of the Security Council, given the kind of constitution and the prevailing distrust among various powers and the blocs.
I think during my tenure in the Prime Minister's office for a very long time, for 10 years, and before that in the DIA, we had gone through many parts of the archives of India and dug out many papers. Now, the thing that emerges also is this discussion about the USA initially making very strong overtures to India. And one of the discussions that is on record is that India did not want to exchange one imperialist power for another. It had just managed to get rid of, the UK or Great Britain, after a very long time, after over 250 years. And with the new imperialistic power, that is, with a huge expeditionary capability, it had, the United States after Second World War, after the Monroe Doctrine became the most powerful force in the Western Hemisphere. It got freed from the Greater Caribbean and it became the most powerful force. After Second World War, with the navies of Great Britain, France, Germany, etc., all being, marginalized and having destroyed each other virtually, the USA was the strongest expeditionary force and the military force in the world. And they wanted bases because in those days there's a huge emphasis on oil. And all the SLOCs for oil of the USA were running from the Middle East, just below India and, just below Sri Lanka, which are the ISLs even now, the international sea lanes even now. And that's why if you look at it, their interest in Trincomalee, etc., and all that. So they were making very strong overtures and they were giving these hints that you ally with us and we will consider this. So the decision that was taken was that we do not want to exchange one imperialistic power for another. We will take bases and then start, dictating your foreign policy, etc., and all that. And it's after that we decided that we still need a very strong patron in the bipolar world. You can't be just an orphan in the bipolar world. And the Cold War was on. The USSR did not have a strong navy. It had no expeditionary power. It had no border with us. So that is why the decision was taken.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for the clarification. And it's true, actually. I've also read about it that there was something that Vijayalakshmi Pandit used to be the ambassador there. And she did, after her discussions at the Capitol, something was mentioned and she sent a letter to the Prime Minister at the time. There is a question to Colonel Sodhi that we used to see Pakistan as threat, but after Wuhan virus, Indian people consider China as the biggest security threat to India. How can we Indians do something to counter China, not military-wise, but diplomatic and economy-wise?
Well, diplomatic-wise, we have to be more vocal and vociferous about the threat that China is to us. Speaking in sugar-coated terms, always indulging in Pakistan bashing, underplaying China's threat is not going to achieve us that success that we're looking at. China is a threat, like I said earlier, which Mr. George Fernandez had said very clearly in 1998. There was so much of political pressure on him. He had to withdraw that statement. It was a threat, it is a threat, and it will remain as the greatest threat. So till the time we don't speak more openly about it diplomatically, we will not project China as a real threat, which is to us. Like I said, we love Pakistan bashing because that gives us electoral gains, electoral advantages. The next question is how to tackle China economically. Well, the only way is that we stop buying the Chinese products. But what can a common Indian citizen do when out of 10 products available off the shelf in the market, 9 are made in China? It is here that the entrepreneurs and businessmen have to play an important role. They should manufacture only in India, make only in India, even at the cost of lesser profit. For a businessman, yes, profit is everything. But here the choice is between the profit and the national security. For every 1 rupee that we're trading with China, the PLA is getting stronger and stronger. And that money is going to be used to kill our soldiers, to maim also our soldiers, till the time the trade isn't stopped by the businessmen. There can be no effect on the economic transaction with China. The government of India cannot stop officially trade with China because we all are signatories to the World Trade Organization treaties. It is the businessmen who have to play an important role. So till the time these 2 basic things are not done, China as a real threat will never be discussed openly in India.
Thank you. I hope that clarifies to our friends Utkarsh for his question. Now, there is a question which is addressed to me that China and external actors have often played with India's fault lines and by engaging players inimical to our interests. Can we do the same to China? And if yes, what are these entities inimical to their interests? This is what we are looking at is there are 2 fronts. One is the border on which we have problems with China. We have had a problem for a long time and we are contesting that out. And China knows that India is possibly the one country that can stand eyeball to eyeball with them. And they have realized this after the Gulf War. But the fact also remains that that's a 5 times larger economy, a much bigger force, more technologically advanced. So I say that as far as China is concerned, we could perhaps look at the 3T options. We should look at Taiwan, we should look at Tibet, and we should look at technology. These are 3 things. If we were to raise the stakes in those, we could perhaps do very similar kind of operations for China is concerned. Of course, everything comes with the power. If you are not economically strong, if you are not militarily strong, it will be very difficult to counter any power from outside. Thirdly, the cohesion within the country is very important. That is not a problem with China. We have a tremendously diversified population. China does not have a free media. It is not a democracy. So you'll have to cultivate constituencies there. And that is very important at the popular level and otherwise. We are working with China on international issues also. So the idea is that you have to develop your strengths. Personally, I feel that we also lack a robust communication strategy, which has a proper ingredients in it. Secondly, we need to do some good research ourselves. I've been writing about it for decades now, that we need to develop our own database about various countries that are raising these issues against India. And we should also be equally active. We should be articulate. We should have some kind of a military diplomacy which should work together. So there are several things that can be done simultaneously to build that strength. A unifocal point that can think about it and plan about it and not work in silos. And of course, internal dissent can always be exploited by our actors, which has been said by all the speakers here and which needs to be guarded against. So I think we have reached the last question. Is there any other question?
I think there are no questions as of now, sir.
So we are closing in on exactly 6:30. Right. So Utkarsh, thank you very much. And firstly, I would like to pay my gratitude to all the esteemed panelists for their excellent comments and analysis. And even throughout the discussions which I have attended, also some of them, I find that we all know what are the challenges. We need to put together those challenges and how and do a SWOT analysis of everything and exactly how we are going to develop our own inner strengths and internal strengths and institutions to deal with them. And in which I think that media plays a very good role, and they need to be on board. The businesses will play, it's a comprehensive strategy. So every aspect of the society will have to be taken into account. Their strengths will have to be converged. And then you know exactly what the government of the day must know, that it is going to be, when we go on the rising curve, that you are going to face these troubles and turbulence, and we need to deal with that in a very effective manner. And that's very important. One of the logical response, of course, could be that you start developing with the better relationships so that external pressure gets reduced. But that does not mean subjugation, being subjugated by their narratives. So cultivating and creating your narrative in the multi-format partnerships and multi-format styles and multi-format domains will be extremely important, so that you can deal with our challenges, which are going to be both for the global reach, for the internal communication, and for the translational nature of challenges and threats that, of course, limit the ability of every individual state to counter these. So it is very important, basically, the collaboration, developing technological tool, and the human resources for this very purpose. We are very good in the information technology. I think that like what we are doing with various other domains, we need to use that talent to exercise the choice and tell the world, because India is generally treated as a benign country. But a benign country does not mean that it can be overly trodden by anyone. And that's what India has always said and continues to maintain it. So we need to develop our comprehensive power and fight with this. Now you know that every country complains that there is a foreign interference. The USA in 2018 elections said that Russia was intervening in their elections. Russia said that USA is intervening in the Indian elections in recent times. We have ourselves said so. And China, of course, is sitting pretty and trying to do whatever they can in the country, because they have a different kind of a polity and a totalitarian regime which can take actions, and their own government is facing the flak. It's not that they are not, they have, but the lot of things don't come out. So I think that it is directly, indirectly, through trade measures. So we'll have to take all those things into account. And there is so much has been said in this seminar, I think, including by our esteemed panelists, which could be taken into account. And you will do well, of course, to collate some of those suggestions and send it across to the concern. So I would like to thank and express my thanks and gratitude to all our esteemed panelists for sharing their views. And of course, to all the participants who could sit until late in the evening. That shows that you are really interested in the topic, and would like to compliment Indic Research Forum for arranging this very important interaction. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trigunayat. Thank you so much, Trigunayat, sir, for chairing this session. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Nalapat, sir, Ambassador Soumen sir, Brigadier Kuldip Singh sir, and Lieutenant Colonel J.S. Sodhi sir for the insightful discussions. With this, we have come to an end of our third session. I request the audience to join us for the fourth session. Thank you very much. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.
Jai Hind.